Let's talk about a scenario, set not too far in the future, 2026 to be exact. It's a story about how a crisis, happening thousands of kilometers away, could bring an entire nation, well, almost, to a standstill. This is all about how one single vulnerable waterway could spark a major energy reckoning for Ireland.
And that's really the big question, isn't it? How can one tiny little spot on the map, so far from Irish shores, possibly trigger a massive national crisis? The answer, it turns out, reveals just how fragile our modern interconnected world really is.
Okay, so the epicenter of this whole story is right here, the Strait of Hormuz. Geographically, it's a very tight squeeze, but strategically, it is one of the most important shipping lanes on the entire planet. Think of it as a superhighway for the world's energy.
Now just let that number sink in for a second. A full 20%, that's 1/5 of the entire planet's oil supply, has to pass through this one narrow passage. So you can imagine, when something disrupts that flow, it doesn't just cause a ripple, it triggers a global tsunami.
And that brings us straight to Ireland. See, as an island nation that imports almost all of its fossil fuels, there's basically no buffer from that kind of global shock. When that tsunami hits, it hits Ireland's shores, and it hits with real force. And it all happens incredibly fast, like a set of dominoes falling over. First, you have the disruption way over in the Gulf. Instantly, the cost to insure an oil tanker goes through the roof. Global markets panic, oil futures spike, and before you know it, the price you pay at the pump isn't just climbing by cents, it's jumping by euros.
At the absolute heart of this crisis is one particular type of fuel, diesel. It's not an exaggeration to say it's what runs the country. It powers the trucks, the tractors, the fishing boats, pretty much the entire backbone of the Irish economy.
So who feels the pain first? The transport sector. Hauliers, they operate on these paper-thin margins. All of a sudden, they literally can't afford to put fuel in their tanks. And their response is as simple as it is drastic. They just park their trucks.
And when the trucks stop moving, well, our supply chains break down. We have this whole system of just-in-time logistics, right? Where stores rely on constant deliveries instead of holding big stockpiles. That system just fails. And for the first time, people walk into their local supermarket and see empty shelves. That's when the public anxiety really starts to kick in.
And that anxiety? It turns into action, and fast. As you can see here, this thing escalates so quickly. What begins as some grumbling from transport groups in week 1 becomes full-blown organized protests by week 2. By week 3, major motorways and even Dublin port are blockaded, grinding parts of the country to a halt, and winning huge public support.
But here's the thing, it wasn't just about fuel. The crisis became this massive economic pressure cooker. It wasn't just the cost of driving your car. It was the cost of heating your home. It was the cost for businesses just to keep the lights on. It was even the cost of producing food. Everything was connected.
And let's just look at how this hits everyday families. This chart shows it all. Look at that jump in household energy bills. Because natural gas prices are tied to these same volatile markets, the cost of electricity shoots up right alongside petrol, pushing a lot of households to a real financial breaking point.
The pain was felt absolutely everywhere across the economy. Manufacturing plants had to scale back production. Those huge data centers, which use a ton of energy, suddenly came under intense public scrutiny. Farmers were getting hit with a triple whammy: high fuel costs, high fertilizer costs, and high transport costs. Even public transport was struggling to cope.
So of course, with a crisis this deep, the government had to do something. But their initial response was really just a series of stopgap measures. They were more focused on putting out fires and managing public anger than on fixing the actual underlying problem.
So they did things like issue temporary rebates to ease the pain at the pump a little bit. They released some of Ireland's strategic oil reserves. And, they made public appeals for everyone to try and use less energy. The thing is, these are basically just Band-Aids. They might buy you a little bit of time, but they don't create any real long-term stability.
But, and this is a really big but, the crisis did cause a fundamental shift in the national mindset. Suddenly, energy independence wasn't some vague, far-off goal anymore. It became an urgent, immediate national priority. The whole timeline for making huge decisions got compressed from, years or decades into just a few months. Beyond just the economics, this was a massive shock to the system. It was that jarring moment of realization that your daily life, your commute to work, your weekly grocery bill, could be completely turned upside down by something happening in a narrow strip of water on the other side of the planet.
There's this quote from the source material that just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures the main lesson here.
Security in the modern world isn't just about armies and borders anymore. It's about the stability of these incredibly complex, incredibly fragile global networks that we all rely on every single day.
So, what happened after the dust settled? Well, things didn't just snap back to the way they were. As you can see, prices eventually stabilized, but at a much higher level than before. Public awareness about energy vulnerability went from basically zero to extremely high. And energy policy? It stayed an urgent priority. A new, more expensive, and much more cautious normal had arrived.
And that leaves all of us with a final, really important question. Ireland managed to get through the storm, but the whole experience exposed this deep, deep vulnerability. In a world where your national stability can depend on a choke point 5,000 kilometers away, what does true security really even look like?